Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to my master's degree thesis presentation based on my paper of the same name, Windows and Mirrors, Making Space for Intersectional Voices in the ELA 6-8 curriculum. And I could not have gotten this far in this presentation without Dr. Elliott and Dr. Lajewski. I'll be doing more thank yous at the end, but I really want to prioritize that at the beginning. So to give you a brief overview of the presentation, I'll do a brief intro. I'll go over my research question. I'll tell you where my voice fits into the literature before I get into my research design. How did I conduct my research? What were my tools? Then I'll show you the findings of my study, and then we'll get into a discussion portion. So, hi, I'm Sophia Campo. I'm a 6th grade ELA teacher at Brown Middle School in Chelsea, and I am the co-leader of a QSA there. And the reason that I started this research is because I'm a queer educator, and as I was starting to teach English language arts for 6th graders, I noticed that there was absolutely no queer representation in the text that we were reading. And there also is very limited representation of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a feminist theory from theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. And if you look over in the bottom left-hand corner where you see this diagram, she basically posits that none of us exist in isolation, and particularly minority groups don't exist in isolation. There are intersections where the things that make us who we are come together. So for example, class, race, and gender are all separate groups, but they also intersect, right? So a Black woman who's poor has a different intersection than a Black woman who's white. But all of those things, than a Black woman who's rich. But all of those things intersect at one point and tell us exactly what we need to know about that person. So the purpose of my study was to create and implement intersectional and LGBTQ inclusive curriculum guidelines for grades 6-8 in English language arts. So the question I posed was, how did the Massachusetts state standards for English language arts in grades 6-8 incorporate intersectionality? And what would an intersectional Common Core aligned LGBTQ friendly ELA 6-8 curriculum look like? So I really wanted to know, is this represented in the standards, and what would a curriculum that looks like that look like if it's not in the standards? So to tell you where my voice fits in with the existing research, in my paper I did what's called a literature review, which is basically when you look at 20 or 30 studies related to the field that you're studying and see what people are saying. So I studied educator surveys, student surveys. I looked at curriculum plans, and I also looked at pedagogical strategies. And I specifically focused on queer representation in literature. I did look at intersectionality as well, but there's a lot written about intersectional curricula, and I really wanted to focus on intersectional and LGBT inclusive curricula. And so this first quote that I have here from G. Gard's 1992 study, Opening Up the Canon, the researcher basically asserts here that it's incredibly important for us as educators not to leave our studies of the experiences of minorities in isolation, meaning don't just put it off till college when you get a women's studies course, or don't put it off till high school when in junior year you get an elective to read literature of the Black Atlantic or African American literature. That it's the responsibility of us as educators to open up these literary canons by creating an intersectional canon. And I really want to draw your attention to the last thing that Gard says here, where it says the responsibility of opening the canons of every discipline so that when our students look in the mirror of history, each one of them will be able to see their own image reflected therein. Now, this is connected to the title of my paper, because there's this idea that's often talked about in the English teacher world, that books should be windows, that they should serve as things that kids look out into the world with. They experience other cultures, they experience other time periods, they experience other identities through literature. And that's great. But I also think that we need to account for mirrors, just like Gard is arguing, that kids also need to feel seen when they are reading stories, because oftentimes maybe a kid is struggling with their sexuality, or maybe a kid is struggling with a disability, or maybe a kid is struggling with their class structure. And to see that representation in a book helps form a feeling of solidarity. And that's directly connected to what Brian Audrey is saying here in Queer Youth and Mental Health, where basically Audrey posits that our current school systems are incredibly heteronormative and operate on a gender binary. So we always have male and female bathrooms. It's, always Mr. and Mrs. It's usually assumed that all educators are straight and married, and that we need to disrupt this system. And one way that's very fast that we can do it to help the mental health and to stop bullying, particularly of queer and gender nonconforming students, is to open up the literary canon. So my research, how did I conduct it? First of all, it was action research, which is a pedagogical type of research that came about in the 1990s. It's essentially different from qualitative and quantitative research studies because the researcher is the participant in the study. So I was the active participant in the study. I was answering my own question. And to do that, I looked at 2 different districts in Massachusetts. Both are very close to Boston, but I chose to keep them anonymous for confidentiality's sake. So District A was a small urban population where at least 18% of that population are identified as in poverty, meaning below the poverty level. District B is a large suburban place where 5% of the population identified as in poverty. So clearly, geographically and class-wise, these districts are very different. I also wanted to compare them because District B has a reputation for being one of the best places in Massachusetts, one of the best schooling systems, one of the best places to live. It's very expensive to live there, partially because many parents move there to put their kids in that district schools in particular. It's also very progressive. So I wanted to see, does their actual curriculum as it's written out reflect the ideals of this place? So here is the big tool that I used. So it looks like a lot at first, but it's relatively simple. So working from the left to the right, I would break down each grade level and the Common Core standards. These are the state Common Core standards. So the way that the standards work, if you're not an English teacher, is there's 4 domains of literacy: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And each of those 4 domains has substandards. So I focus specifically on the reading substandards. There's 10 of each per grade level. So I would cite the standard, and then I would rewrite the standard, still keeping whatever the standard is assessing and transforming it into something that's more intersectional. So if the standard didn't account for any intersectionality, I transformed it, as you can see in the yellow column, to make it intersectional. And then I took my evidence from District B's standards, their curriculum, and I would rate it on a scale of 0 to 4. And then I would take District A's standards and I would also rate it. And so I also, and I'll get into what they scored and how all of that worked. I also looked at the state recommended text sets. So there's no prescribed curriculum of exactly what needs to be taught, informed by the state, but they do make a recommendation. And I listed genre, author, and then I also rated those on an intersectionality scale. And then I made my own appendix that was an intersectional text set recommendation broken down by grade level. So the 2 tools that I used, you can see the top tool is the curriculum rubric. So like I said, that's a scale of 0 to 4. A 0 meaning the standard as written by that district does not include any mention of diversity or inclusivity in any way, of race, gender, class, sex, whatever. A 4 would be that it's a highly intersectional standard, that it's accounting for diversity across many different fields and also is teaching students to analyze things through those fields. So for the intersectional text rating tool, very similar. I just did it on a scale of 1 to 5. So a 1 would be the text is not intersectional in any way. A 5 means it's incredibly intersectional. Now, I'm not arguing that we need to get to 4s and 5s for everything. I actually think that we should be in the 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 range for most things. I would be really happy with just a middle ground, with a few outliers on either end. There are some classes that are not, there are some classics that are not terribly intersectional, like Hamlet, for example, that I do think still should be taught. So here were my findings. So like I said, there were 10 substandards, and each district scored a 1 out of 10, meaning they all had sort of a general, at least one time out of the 10, they mentioned something related to diversity, but it wasn't incredibly intersectional. And I think the reason that their results were so similar is because each of the districts just took exactly what the state recommended and paraphrased it into their own curriculum. And because the state did not recommend anything to do with diversity, neither did the districts. So I'll show you 2 examples of how I determined a 1. So if you look, this is the curriculum tool. This is for an 8th grade standard. Range of reading, level of text complexity. If you look at the second blue column, this is District A's reinterpretation of that standard. So the text that's in bold is what earned it a 1. So they're saying a variety of genres, cultures, and perspectives. They're not being specific about the cultures or perspectives that should exist, but they're saying students should read them. So I gave that a 1 because it's very general. They're making an effort to be diverse, but they're not being specific in the kind of diversity they want or the way that teachers should teach that. So for District B, we also have, so the way that they did their curriculum was a little bit more long-winded than the way that District A did, but basically they also scored a 1 here. For the text that's underlined at the very bottom, where it says text may contain language that is archaic or from regional dialects or language other than English. Again, that's very general. They're sort of hinting at the idea that diverse cultures should be represented, but they're not explicitly stating it, and they're not explaining how. So my conclusions were that the state standards don't mention diversity or intersectionality at all, and that this directly impacts how districts model their curricula. They're just taking what the state's doing and slightly tweaking it to make it their own. This means that it's easier and more common to teach non-intersectional skills, to just teach a story that has a Black protagonist through a racial lens, or only focus on the theme of racism in that story, because that text is not incredibly intersectional, or because you're not being told how to teach it intersectionally. So all of this brings me to my final point, which is that schools aren't progressing at the rate that our American culture is, or at least schools in Massachusetts aren't. So the implications for the future, the way that this can change. I think the first thing that needs to happen is that the state standards need to be modified to include the words intersectional, diverse, and inclusive, and before a text is mentioned. So they don't need to be rewritten. It doesn't need to be crazy. We just need to insert these words as sort of an insurance policy. That means once they're in there, states need to take accountability for them, and districts need to take accountability for them and actually use them. Second, I think that teachers need to be trained through professional development practices on how to teach in an intersectional way, how to analyze a story from many different perspectives and the way that those perspectives interact. Because I don't think that this is a skill that necessarily all teachers are given. We're not often taught how to teach literature. We're just taught to teach skills through literature. And finally, I think that the anchor texts and academic canons that the state and districts use need to be revised and reformed to be more intersectional and inclusive. There are tons and tons of great works out there that are appropriate for young adult readers, that are highly intersectional, that are not used. So to conclude, my next steps are going to be paying off my loans and revising my own curriculum over the summer. I can't change the books that I'm teaching, but I can change the way that I teach them, and I will be intentionally making them more intersectional. And I'm also considering, within 5 to 7 years, not right now, maybe pursuing a PhD in English literature. And I want to close with a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, the theorist who created this theory, where she says, sorry, let me go back. She says, if we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. And I truly believe this, and it also accounts for our kids. So with that said, I want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Elliott, my research advisor. I really couldn't have done it without him. To Dr. Lajewski and Dr. Merritt for really helping me every step of the way along with this paper and this presentation. To Sister Karen and Ms. Frazier from the Education Department for letting me do this degree and for telling me about it and for telling me not to give up. to my colleagues, my classmates, my professors, and my family. I really couldn't have done it without you guys. And seriously, thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me that you're here. So with that said, I'm going to open things up to questions, discussion. I really want to hear what you all think and what your opinions are.